Void.net. 3 Stories of World War II Norway from Wikipedia. Read by The Voice Before the Void. Carl Fredriksson's Transport. From Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Carl Fredriksson's Transport was the code name for an operation during the occupation of Norway by Nazi Germany to help Jews and other persecuted Norwegians escape persecution, deportation, and murder in death camps. The name of Carl Fredriksson's Transport was based on the name of the exiled Norwegian king Haakon VII, who was Carl, son of Frederick, but also sounded like a common Norwegian name. Background: the Nazi regime in Norway implemented its part of the Holocaust through a series of steps, starting with registration, then confiscation, internment and concentration, and ultimately deportation of Jews, primarily to Auschwitz. Some Jews had fled Norway to Sweden earlier in the war, but most had stayed in their homes until October 26, 1942. At that point, most men were arrested and detained in prison camps, while women and children were ordered to report to the nearest police station on a daily basis. The Escape Operation. Although the Norwegian resistance movement had maintained a series of escape routes to Sweden, they were unprepared to deal with the urgent plight of Jews who faced deportation. In addition, simultaneously with the arrest and deportation of Jews in 1942, the Gestapo launched an offensive to identify and apprehend members of the Norwegian resistance. This put pressure both on the viability and capacity of existing escape routes. Carl Fredriksson's Transport came into being when 4 Jewish Norwegians appeared on the doorstep of nursery owner Rolf A. Syversen, asking for help. Through one of the leaders of the military resistance group Milorg, Ole Berg, Syversen contacted Alf Tollef Petersen, who had been fired from the Norwegian police force for refusing to pledge loyalty to the Quisling regime. Petersen was intimately familiar with the roads from Oslo to the Swedish border. What started with a few nighttime drives turned into a large-scale operation. The group accepted all refugees, but charged those who could afford it 180 kroner. In time, the civilian resistance group Sivorg put its clandestine network and financial resources behind it. Petersen, his wife Gerd, Syversen, and the resistance leader Reidar Larsen managed the operation. Altogether, about 1,000 refugees were moved to safety, of whom approximately 500 were Jewish. After having found their way to Syversen's nursery near Karl Berner's Plass in Oslo, refugees were loaded in the backs of trucks and covered with a tarp. Children were often sedated. Gerd Petersen forged bills of lading and other necessary documents. Sivorg's network along the route monitored German and border police patrols. The route varied somewhat, but would typically end up near Orderudseter, just a few hundred yards short of the Swedish border. The refugees would walk this last distance. The operation started in late November 1942. About 10 truckloads a week went to the border and back in the dark of night, mostly with headlights off. By mid-January, the network had been infiltrated by Norwegian collaborators and had to be shut down. the Petershens made a successful dash for the border in a sedan, breaking an axle just as they crossed into Sweden. Rolf Syversen stayed in Oslo and was later arrested for an unrelated matter. He was executed at Trandumskogen in November 1944. Commemoration. Although this was the largest rescue operation in Norway during World War II, it was virtually unknown for decades. In order to maintain operational security, the refugees were not aware that they were part of a larger scheme, and their rescuers' identities were kept secret in any event. Ragnar Ulstein, a historian who specialized in the stream of refugees from Norway to Sweden, uncovered the most important features during an interview with Alf Tollef Petersen. The Oslo Jewish Museum continued the research started by Ulstein and interviewed Gerd Petersen before she died. In September 2010, a commemorative plaque and cast iron truck were unveiled at the turnoff to the private road that led to the Swedish border. A bicycle ride named after the operation takes place in mid-August, from Fetsund along the original route to the border crossing with Sweden. Feldman Case. From Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. The Feldman Case, Feldman-saken, was a controversial criminal case in Norway in which two border pilots admitted to killing an elderly Jewish couple during their escape from the Holocaust in Norway and stealing their money. A jury acquitted the two of culpability for the killing, accepting their explanation that the couple endangered not just the mission, but the viability of the escape route to Sweden. Prelude. On October 22, 1942, a train on Østfoldbanen included 10 refugees bound for Sweden, of whom 9 were Jewish. Also traveling were 2 border pilots, Karsten Lurvestad and Harry Pedersen, both of whom may have been wanted by the occupying authorities. Between Skjeberg and Dyrle stations, Norwegian police came through the cars inspecting identification cards. The border pilot Lurvestad and 2 of the Jewish refugees, Herman Feldman and Willy Sherman, were asked by a committed Norwegian Nazi policeman to step outside their cabin. Lurvestad, who was carrying a forged passport, shot the policeman. The 3 then jumped off the speeding train. Feldman broke an arm in the fall. The trio evaded capture for some time, but were eventually caught in one of the largest police campaigns in the war. Feldman, Sherman, and the other Jewish refugees were murdered in Auschwitz in August 1943. Lurvestad was executed in September 1943, after appearing before a tribunal without the benefit of a defense. The Nazi authorities made propaganda out of the incident. Newspaper headlines portrayed it as a cold-blooded murder of a faithful public servant at the hands of Jews. The policeman's funeral was attended by the top echelon of both the German and Norwegian Nazi authorities. Well-plated editorials called for decisive action against Jews. Raquel and Jacob Feldman. Herman Feldman's foster parents were Raquel and Jacob Feldman. Unnerved by the publicity this incident had caused, they had decided to make their own break for the Swedish border. They showed up at the farm of the Lurvestad family in Trugestad on October 23rd, asking for refuge and help to find their way across the border. As the area was still subject to surveillance and search by police forces, the Lurvestad family was under significant pressure and risk of discovery. The couple stayed hidden in the area for a few days, until two border pilots, Haakon Lurvestad and Peder Pedersche, offered to conduct them across the border. The couple borrowed clothing and footwear for a 2-day hike. But when the company of 4 arrived at Skrikerhutternet, the border pilots clubbed the Jewish couple to death, stole their money, and sunk the bodies in the lake with weights. Lurvestad fled to Sweden wearing Feldman's gold watch. Pedersche returned to his home and resumed piloting refugees across the border, including several Jews. Trial and verdict. The Feldmans' bodies eventually floated to the surface and were discovered, and investigations led to the prosecution of Lurvestad and Pedersche. The matter came to trial in 1947. Although the two accused did not deny that they had killed the couple and taken their money, they claimed they had no real choice in the matter. The Feldmans were old, overweight, and incapable of the long walk to the border. They were bound to be discovered where they were, and their arrest and detention would bring down the Underground Railroad, endangering many more lives than theirs. The two were acquitted of killing the couple, but were convicted for stealing their money, which amounted to 12,000 Norwegian kroner, and their possessions. During the debate surrounding the verdict, Oskar Hasselknipe, a resistance leader during the war and the editor of a leading Norwegian newspaper, challenged Leo Eitinger's criticism of the verdict, pointing out that in war, difficult decisions sometimes have to be made. He implied that Eitinger would not understand this, asking Eitinger where he had been during the war. To which Eitinger replied, "In Auschwitz." Leo Eitinger, from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Leo Eitinger, 1912 December 12th to 1996 October 15th, was a Holocaust survivor and Norwegian psychiatrist who studied late-onset psychological trauma amongst Holocaust survivors, of whom many, like Paul Celan and Primo Levi, committed suicide due to Holocaust trauma, several decades after the experience, towards late adulthood. Early life. Eitinger was born in Lomnica, Moravia, at that time a town in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, currently in the Czech Republic. He studied medicine at the Masaryk University of Brno, graduated in 1937, and was drafted as an officer into the Czech Air Force. In 1939, he fled Nazi persecution of Jews and came to Norway as a refugee with the help of Nansen-Hjelpen. Upon arriving in Norway, he arranged for Jewish children to escape from Czechoslovakia to settle in the Jewish orphanage in Oslo. He was given permission to work as a resident in psychiatry in Norway in Bodø, but the permission was revoked by the Nazis after they invaded the country in 1940. During World War II, Eitinger stayed underground from January 1941 until he was arrested in March 1942. He was imprisoned in various places throughout Norway before being deported on the ship Gotenland on February 24, 1943, arriving by train at the concentration camp at Auschwitz, where the number 105268 was tattooed on his arm. He was later moved to Buchenwald. Of the 762 Jews deported from Norway to German concentration camps, only 23 survived. Eitinger was one of them. After returning to Norway, he specialized in psychiatry. Holocaust psychiatrist. In 1966, Eitinger was appointed professor of psychiatry at the University of Oslo and became head of the University Psychiatric Clinic. After the war, Eitinger allocated his time and efforts to the study of human suffering, with emphasis on clinical psychiatry, in particular victimology and disaster psychiatry. He conducted several landmark studies about the long-term psychological and physical effects of surviving extreme stress and being a refugee. When the World Health Organization published its new classification of mental disorders in 1992, ICD-10, it included a category called Enduring Personality Change After Catastrophic Experience, a diagnostic concept based on the work of Eitinger. Leo and Liesl Eitinger devoted their lives to the promotion of human rights and the fight against injustice and racism. The University of Oslo's Human Rights Award, the Liesl and Leo Eitinger Prize, is named in their honor. This sound file and all text in the articles are licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 Unported license, available at creativecommons.org.